It had been a rough few years for me. Leaving the army wasn't the hard part. Trying to live like a regular human afterward was. People think you can just turn it off, like flipping a switch. But the memories, the instinct to stay alert, the goddamn nightmares, it all lingers. Civilian life felt like I didn't fit. So I figured I'd do what I knew best, get the hell away from everyone. That's how I ended up renting a cabin in the middle of nowhere, deep in the woods of Virginia. A spot so quiet, the only noise you'd hear was the wind shaking the leaves or the occasional hoot of an owl. Perfect. The place was straight, so quiet. I planned to hike, clear my head, maybe wrestle with my demons in peace. But of course, life has a way of throwing curveballs. On my second evening there, just as the sun was dipping below the treetops, there was a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting company, so I opened it cautiously, half expecting to find some lost tourist or maybe even a bear sniffing around. Instead, it was an older man, wiry and weathered, like he'd spent his whole life out here. He introduced himself as Asa Dempsey and said he lived about half a mile down the trail. His voice was raspy, his words slow and deliberate, like the woods had taught him patience. "Heading into town for a few days," Asa said, leaning on his cane. "Wanted to ask a favor, seeing as you're new round here." I nodded, letting him talk. "My daughter, Wren, stayed back. She's 20, studying at the college. Smart kid, but stubborn as hell. Told her she ought to come with me, but she insisted on staying put. You mind keeping an eye on the place? Not much goes on around here, but I'd feel better knowing someone's close by." I told him, sure, I'd help out. What was I supposed to say? No? He gave me directions to his place. It wasn't far. Maybe a 5-minute walk through the woods if you stuck to the trail. He thanked me, tipped his hat, and shuffled off into the gathering dusk. The next 2 days were uneventful. I spent most of the time hiking. I didn't see Wren or anyone else, which suited me fine. I figured she was busy with her books, or whatever. Then, late on the third night, my phone buzzed. I had 1 bar of signal, barely enough to get calls, and when I picked up, I heard a trembling voice on the other end. It was Wren. "Someone's outside," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They're trying to get in." My stomach dropped. I asked her to lock the doors and stay put, while I grabbed what I had, a machete I'd brought for clearing trails and a hammer I kept by the door. I wasn't armed like I used to be, but I wasn't going out there empty-handed either. The trail to Asa's place was pitch black, the kind of dark where you can't see your hand in front of your face. When I got close, I saw the faint glow of Wren's house through the trees. The place was small, with a single porch light, and then I saw him, a dark figure at the back door, hunched over, messing with the handle. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice ripping through the stillness. The figure froze, turning slowly to face me. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a dark jacket with a hood pulled low over his face. For a split second, we just stood there, sizing each other up. Then I saw him pull something from his pocket, a knife. My grip tightened on the machete. This wasn't some drunk neighbor who'd wandered too far from home. This was someone who meant harm. "You better get the fuck out of here," I growled, taking a step closer. "Now." He didn't move. Just stood there, knife in hand, like he was weighing his options. I kept walking, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Last chance, you hell," I barked. "You don't want to test me." He came at me fast, but not fast enough. I sidestepped and swung the machete, aiming for his arm. He jumped back, the blade just missing him. He slashed at me with a knife, catching the sleeve of my jacket but not skin. I swung again, this time connecting with his forearm. He yelped, the knife clattering to the ground. Before I could press the advantage, he bolted, tearing off into the woods like a scared deer. I chased him for maybe 50 yards, before realizing how stupid that was. It was dark, I didn't know the terrain, and he could have been leading me into a trap. So I stopped, listening as his footsteps faded into the distance. By the time I got back to the house, Wren was standing at the window, her pale face lit by the porch light. I motioned for her to stay put while I checked the perimeter. The bastard was gone, and apart from some scratches on the door where he'd tried to pry it open, everything seemed fine. I went inside and found Wren clutching a baseball bat, her hands shaking. She couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, but she looked like she was ready to swing for the fences if she had to. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded. "Yeah, thanks." I stayed with her the rest of the night, keeping watch. We didn't talk much, but the intruder never came back. By morning, I walked her down to my cabin, figuring she'd be safer there until Asa returned. I didn't tell him everything when he got back, just that someone had been snooping around. No point in worrying the old man more than he needed to be. The guy who tried to break in never caught him. I still don't know who he was or what he wanted. I think about that night, about how close it came to going a different way. You should always be prepared to handle the worst scenarios in the deep woods. So don't just pack for comfort. Pack for survival. Bring a weapon, something sharp, heavy, or both. Life can be unpredictable, even for someone like me, who prides himself on being prepared for just about anything. I've been hiking and camping for years, always seeking out those remote spots where the wilderness is untouched, pure, and silent. It was late summer, and I had planned a weekend camping trip with my 2 closest friends, Nathan and Rob. We'd all known each other since college, bonded over a shared love of the outdoors and adventure. Over the years, life had pulled us in different directions, but we made a promise to keep these trips going, no matter what. Nathan and Rob were both seasoned hikers, just like me. We were the kind of guys who thrived on the challenge of finding spots off the beaten path, places most people wouldn't even think to explore. For this trip, we'd settled on a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains, far away from any marked trails or signs of civilization. We wanted to disconnect, recharge, and immerse ourselves in the beauty of the wilderness. We arrived on a Friday afternoon after a grueling drive that took us miles away from any semblance of civilization. The last leg of the journey was a narrow, unpaved access road that wound through dense forest, with trees so thick they blocked out most of the sunlight. It was the kind of road that made you second-guess your directions, but eventually, we found a small clearing that seemed perfect for our camp. The clearing was surrounded by towering pines and oaks, their branches forming a canopy that made the area feel even more secluded. We set up our tents near the edge of the clearing, close enough to each other for comfort, but far enough apart to give us some space. A small creek ran nearby, providing fresh water, and there was plenty of dry wood for a fire. It was exactly what we'd been looking for: quiet, peaceful, and completely isolated. The first day passed without incident. We spent the afternoon exploring the surrounding woods, scouting for trails and taking in the beauty of the area. By the time the sun began to set, we were back at camp, tired but satisfied. Nathan started a fire while Rob cooked dinner, and we sat around the flames. It was during our second evening that things began to feel off. We'd spent most of the day hiking along an old logging trail we'd discovered, covering nearly 10 miles before returning to camp. We gathered around the fire again, enjoying the stillness of the woods. That's when we noticed it, a pair of headlights cutting through the darkness, slowly creeping along the same unpaved access road we'd used to get here. "Who the hell is that?" Nathan muttered. The 3 of us watched as the vehicle, a black SUV, rolled slowly down the road. It wasn't unusual to see the occasional car in the mountains, but this felt different. The area we'd chosen was so remote that it seemed unlikely anyone else would be out here, especially at this hour. The SUV came to a stop about 300 yards from our campsite. For a long moment, it just sat there, its headlights off, idling in the darkness. "That's creepy as hell," Rob said, shifting uneasily. Probably someone lost, I said, though I didn't fully believe it myself. It may be 10 to 15 minutes later. The SUV backed up slowly and disappeared into the trees. We sat there in silence for a while. Eventually, we tried to brush it off. Maybe it really was just someone who'd taken a wrong turn, but the mood had shifted. We decided to call it a night and headed to our tents, locking up our gear and double-checking the campsite. The woods were deathly quiet as we settled in. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I woke to the sound of movement. At first, I thought it was one of the guys getting up to use the bathroom, but then I heard it again, soft, deliberate footsteps circling the campsite. "Nathan? Rob?" I whispered, but neither of them responded. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside, my heart pounding. I saw her, a woman, standing near the edge of the clearing. She was wearing a dark hoodie, her face pale and gaunt, and she moved with an almost unnatural stillness. She crept toward one of our gear bags, crouching low as if she thought she could go unnoticed. I was frozen, unsure of what to do. Then I shouted, "Hey! What the hell are you doing?" The woman's head snapped up, and she bolted into the woods without a word. My shouting woke Nathan and Rob, and we quickly grabbed flashlights, scanning the tree line for any sign of her. "Did you see her?" Rob asked, his voice shaky. "Yeah," I said. "She was messing with our gear." We spent the next hour on high alert, but there was no sign of the woman. The forest was dark and impenetrable, leaving us alone with our thoughts and fears. We didn't sleep much that night. The hours crawled by as we sat by the dying fire, clutching our flashlights and watching the clock. Then, just after 3 a.m., the silence was broken by a sound that sent chills down my spine. Screams. It came from deep in the woods, high-pitched and desperate, echoing through the trees. We couldn't tell how far away they were, each one more haunting than the last. Then it stopped. None of us spoke. What could we say? We were miles from help, with no cell service and no way to contact anyone. All we could do was wait for morning and hope we'd make it through the night. It was just before the morning light. We were just packing our gear. Then we noticed something that made our stomachs drop. A set of footprints, fresh and distinct, leading from the woods to the edge of our camp. On our way out, we passed a small, abandoned cabin about a mile from our site. The door was ajar, and there were signs of a struggle: broken glass, overturned furniture, and dark stains on the floor. Later, we learned from local authorities that a violent crime had occurred there during the night. Witnesses had reported seeing a black SUV speeding away from the area. We left the mountains that day, shaken and unnerved. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but the memory of that woman's face and the screams in the night still lingers. We didn't went there again on that spot again. This one happened to me in 2019, when I was 16. My brothers Kieran and Malachi and I made the worst decision of our lives. It was one of those blistering Georgia summers when life was on the edge, like it was suffocating you. We lived just near to the Chattahoochee National Forest, surrounded by dense woods that stretched for miles. It wasn't unusual for us to roam around the backroads or hike deep into the wilderness, but this time, our usual escape turned into something I'll never forget. Home was a war zone. My parents' marriage was collapsing in front of our eyes, and their fights had reached a fever pitch. That day, it was impossible to stay inside without feeling like you'd be crushed by their screaming. Kieran, the oldest at 22, slammed his fist on the table, his face red with frustration. "That's it. We're leaving," he barked. Malachi, 19 and always the quieter one, looked up from his spot on the couch. "Where are we even going?" "Anywhere but here," Kieran said, grabbing his truck keys. "We'll find a spot in the woods, just a couple of hours away from this hellhole." I didn't argue. When Kieran made up his mind, there was no point fighting it, and honestly, I wanted out as much as he did. I followed them to Kieran's rusted Ford, hopping into the back seat. We drove about an hour, leaving behind paved roads and cell reception. The truck groaned as we climbed up narrow, gravel trails, the thick canopy of trees swallowing the last rays of daylight. After nearly an hour, we stopped at the edge of a dirt path blocked off by a rusted metal gate. The sign attached to it was so weathered it was illegible. "What's down there?" I asked, squinting at the overgrown trail beyond. Kieran leaned on the steering wheel, squinting. "An old house, maybe. I heard about it from someone back in town. Supposed to be abandoned for years." "Sounds sketchy," I muttered. Malachi shrugged. "Beats sitting at home listening to them scream." With that, Kieran shoved open the door, grabbed a flashlight, and climbed over the gate. Malachi and I followed without hesitation. The walk wasn't far, maybe 20 or 30 minutes, but the woods felt unnervingly quiet. The deeper we went, the more my stomach twisted. Then the house appeared. It was a 2-story wreck, standing like a corpse in the middle of the woods. The roof sagged, the walls were covered in vines, and the windows were broken. Rusted nails jutted out from the warped wood of the porch, and the whole place reeked of rot. "Creepy," Malachi muttered. "Perfect," Kieran said with a grin. I rolled my eyes but followed them up the groaning steps of the porch. The door was ajar, and Kieran shoved it open with one hand. The interior was even worse. The air inside was thick and stifling, filled with the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. The floorboards were warped and covered in dust and debris, empty cans, broken glass, and scraps of fabric that looked like they'd been there for decades. "This is disgusting," I said, kicking an old beer can out of my way. Kieran smirked. "It's history, era. Live a little." I wandered into what must have been the living room. The furniture was broken and moldy, the walls stained with water damage. An old fireplace stood in the corner, blackened with soot. "This place is a death trap," I muttered. "Stop whining," Kieran called from the kitchen. "We're just looking around. Nothing's gonna happen." I was about to retort when I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. "Guys," I called out, "I think we should go." "What now?" Kieran groaned, stepping into the room with Malachi behind him. Before I could answer, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming from somewhere upstairs. All 3 of us froze. "What was that?" Malachi whispered. "Let's just go," I said, backing toward the door. But before we could move, a figure emerged at the top of the stairs. It was a man, tall and gaunt. His clothes were filthy, hanging off his wiry frame like rags, and his eyes, God, his eyes were like a predator's, wild and calculating. "Who the hell are you?" Kieran shouted, stepping in front of me and Malachi. The man didn't answer. He just started descending the stairs, his movements slow and deliberate. "Stay back," Kieran shouted, grabbing a piece of wood from the floor. The man didn't stop. His lips curled into a smile, if you could call it that, and then he lunged. Everything happened so fast. Kieran swung the wood, barely missing the man's head. Malachi grabbed an old crowbar lying on the floor and shoved it into my hands. Take it," he yelled. The man was relentless, thrashing and swinging his arms as he tried to get past Kieran. I stood there, frozen, until Kieran shouted over his shoulder, "Get out of here!" Now. I didn't want to leave them, but I knew I had to. I bolted out the door, the crowbar still clutched in my hands. A few moments later, I heard footsteps pounding behind me. I spun around, ready to swing the crowbar, but it was Kieran and Malachi, their faces pale and covered in scratches. "Keep running," Kieran yelled, grabbing my arm. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. Kieran fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and we peeled out of there so fast the tires kicked up gravel. When we finally pulled into the driveway, Kieran killed the engine and turned to us. "Never again," he said. "We never told our parents or anyone else what happened. We didn't go back to those woods, either. Even now, I can't shake the image of that man, the way he moved, the way his eyes seemed to see right through us. It's a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, of how dangerous the world can be when you think you're untouchable. This was the story of my mother, and I am recounting what had actually happened to her. A scared 11-year-old girl in the middle of nowhere. It happened decades ago, but the chill of that night has never left her. Let me tell you how it all went down, the kind of thing you never forget, no matter how much time passes. Back then, my mom's family used to rent this old, secluded cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It was a cold night in early winter when they packed up the car and headed out for a weekend getaway. The kind of place that was so far from civilization, you'd have to drive for miles on unpaved roads just to find it. The air was cold and biting that night, with snow already coated the ground. The cabin was a creaky relic, older than my mom's grandparents, built right on the edge of an endless stretch of wilderness. You could hear the wind howling through the trees, and when you stepped outside, the snow crunched underfoot, making everything feel eerie, even though there was no one around for miles. It wasn't the kind of place you'd go to for luxury. Every year, the family would rent this cabin, usually for a weekend. The first night had passed without a hitch. But that second night, that's when things went wrong. My mom remembers it clearly. The whole family was snuggled up by the fire, warm and cozy in the middle of nowhere. After the fire had burned out and everyone was in bed, things changed. My mom woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented, not sure if it was the cold or just a bad dream that had dragged her out of sleep. The room was dim. Moonlight slanted through the small window next to her bed. Then she heard it. A faint scratching sound, like nails on glass. She thought it was just the wind, or maybe a branch scraping against the cabin. But something didn't sit right. The trees, she remembered, weren't close to the cabin. There was nothing that could cause that sound, nothing at all. She was lying there, frozen, trying to convince herself it was nothing. But the scratching kept going, sharp and insistent, like it was coming from just outside her window. It wasn't until she finally worked up the nerve to pull the curtain aside that she saw him. A man, standing in the moonlight, wearing a filthy hockey mask, staring right at her. The only thing she could make out in the dim light was his breath fogging up the glass as he exhaled. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching her with creepy eyes. My mom was so terrified, her whole body locked up. She couldn't scream, couldn't move. It was like she was stuck in a nightmare. She could feel the cold sweat on her palms, her heart racing in her chest. This wasn't some drunk person stumbling through the woods. This was something else. And then, after staring at her, he was gone. The man turned, disappearing into the woods, just like that. No explanation. My mom's mind raced, but she couldn't make sense of it. She could barely breathe. In a panic, she managed to shake her father awake, shaking and gasping in terror, trying to explain what she had seen. My grandpa, a tough-as-nails guy, jumped out of bed. He grabbed his shotgun. He didn't ask much questions more. "Who the hell is out there?" Grandpa bellowed as he slammed the cabin door open, stepping out into the cold night. The air was so cold outside. He clutched his shotgun, eyes scanning the dark. "Come out and face me, you coward." My mom held her breath, still frozen in fear. Her brothers stood behind her, peeking out from the window, their faces pale. Grandpa snapped, his breath coming out in angry puffs. "You think you can mess with my family? Think again." He fired into the air, 3 shots. Then he said, "Come on. Show yourself." Silence. To silence. "I swear to God, if I catch you, you won't be walking away," Grandpa muttered. He paced back and forth, gripping the gun tightly, but the woods stayed still. No movement, no sound, like nothing had been there at all. Finally, he stomped back inside, slamming the door behind him. Damn fools, he grumbled. Probably just some punk screwing around. Mom sat on the couch, still shaking. I saw him, Dad. I swear. He was right there. He had a mask. He had a knife. Grandpa sighed, rubbing his face. You're scaring yourself, kid. I am with you. Just stop crying, all right? No one's out there. But enough, he snapped. Go to bed. All of you. Then, morning came like nothing had ever happened. Grandpa checked around the cabin again, shotgun in hand, but there was no trace of anything. No footprints. No sign of anyone. After that, they stayed a few more nights, but nothing happened after that. Mom never forgot that night. Never stopped feeling the fear crawl up her spine when she thought about it. And she never went back to that cabin again. It was the fall of 2020, and the world was still reeling from the pandemic. Lockdowns, isolation, paranoia, everyone was looking for an escape. So when Zafira suggested a camping trip deep in the Montana wilderness, it was a good option. A chance to breathe, to be free from the world's suffocating fear. There were 5 of us, me, Zafira, Eli, Carter, and Nora. The plan was simple: set up by the lake, drink too much, laugh too loud, and pretend like things were normal again. But from the start, something felt wrong. Zafira had been acting off for months, but out here, in the middle of nowhere, it was like something in her cracked wide open. Actually, she had been acting off for months, moody, volatile, lost in her own head. She'd always been wild, but this was different. Darker. That night, she was drinking from a flask, the stench of cheap whiskey thick in the air. Her eyes darted toward me, sharp and mean, and every time I laughed, every time I spoke, her expression twisted like she was sucking on something sour. I ignored it. I had gotten used to her moods, the way her energy shifted without warning. But looking back, I should have known. It was around midnight. The fire died down. One by one, our friends disappearing into their tents, leaving just the 2 of us. She grabbed my wrist, her fingers cold, her grip a little too tight. Sleep in my tent, she slurred, her breath hot with liquor. Don't want to be alone. Something in my gut twisted, but I brushed it off. All right, I muttered. No point in arguing. We crawled into the cramped space, the fabric walls pressing in around us. I rolled onto my side, exhausted, my body aching from the long day. The wind howled outside, rustling the trees. And then, maybe just an hour passed, extreme hot pain exploded in my chest. For a second, my brain refused to understand what was happening. I gasped, a strangled, wet sound, my hands flying to my ribs. Warmth spread beneath my fingers, sticky, hot. My breath hitched, my vision blurring as I saw the knife in Zafira's hand, her eyes wide and feral. You think you can just take whatever you want? She hissed, voice dripping venom. You think he actually loves you? You think you're special? I choke, the taste of copper thick in my mouth. Zafira? I shouted, my body frozen in shock. She smiled, slow and ugly, then raised the knife again. My body moved before my brain caught up, my arms shooting up just as she brought the blade down. But I didn't care. I kicked out, catching her in the gut, sending her sprawling backward. The tent buckled as we struggled. She lunged again. I grabbed her wrist, my fingers digging into her skin, but she was strong. Too strong. She slammed me down, the back of my head cracking against the ground. I barely managed to roll as the knife plunged into the dirt where my neck had been. You crazy bitch, I snarled, my hands finding her face. I dug my nails into her skin, raking down. She screamed, flailing, the knife slipping from her grasp. My knees shot up, slamming into her stomach. Just then, the tent suddenly ripped open. Our friends dragged Zafira off me. She fought like an animal, thrashing, shrieking, her eyes locked onto mine with pure hatred. I collapsed, gasping, my entire body trembling. The next few hours were a blur. Someone called for help. Someone wrapped my wounds. Zafira was held down until paramedics came. Later, they said she was sick. Schizophrenia, they told me. She had lost touch with reality. But all I could hear was her voice in my head. You ruined everything. I should have seen it coming. I should have known. But it was too late. I survived. I couldn't sleep for weeks. I stopped going out. The scars on my arm healed, but some wounds are too deep to ever truly disappear.